So lovely to be here, and today I'd like to share with you some insights on the blue economy. How many of you have heard of the blue economy before you saw the program? A couple of you? Okay. So we're not actually talking about the economics of our oceans here, but we are talking about a whole blue planet. And it's interesting that from space, we don't talk about the green planet, we talk about the blue planet. We are 75% water, and more interestingly than that though, is we are talking about one living system. It's the ultimate of systems, isn't it? Planet Earth, our blue planet. This whole concept started in 1994 with the fellow on the left. His name is Gunter Pauli. The fellow on the right is the rector of the UN University, Virgílio de Souza. He in fact challenged Gunter, who had just very successfully built the world's first ecological production facility looking at cleaning products, a company called Ecova. I'll come back and talk about some learnings from that in a minute. But he wanted to challenge this entrepreneur who had been part of the think tank. He'd been mentored by the founder of the Club of Rome, a think tank that had commissioned the work on the limits to growth, who had been thinking about the planetary boundaries and these sorts of ecological issues for a long time. He challenged Gunter to come up with a competitive business model that was going to run alongside the Kyoto Protocol. So this was 3 years prior to the Kyoto Protocol coming into action. What was going to be important about this is that they did want it to be inspired by nature with zero waste. And let's face it, there is no waste in nature. And of course, the reason there is no waste in nature is because the waste of one plant or one animal, it actually becomes the food for another. And that's the philosophy behind the circular economy and very much behind the blue economy. So, interestingly, when Gunter built his Ecova ecological manufacturing facility, it was the greenest of the green at that point in time. They were all renewable sources, all biodegradable plastics that he was using, and he started to be asked questions like, well, how much waste is in those renewable products? You might only be using 5%. How much waste is there? They also started to say things like, well, the palm sugar, do you realise what is happening now that they're chopping down the forests of the orangutans to actually build, to grow the palm sugar? So one big takeout for Gunter was that just because it was natural, just because you were using something that was biodegradable and it was renewable sources, it doesn't actually mean that it's sustainable. And in fact, the story for him there was when they realised, this was an absolute aha moment, when he realised that that was the case and started to talk about it internally within the organisation and with his family. His kids said to him, "Dad, if you don't sell that company, we will never speak to you again." And that's the sort of thing that's happening today. When there is that moment in time when you realise that you're doing something that's harmful and you're not prepared to do something about it, it is dividing families. It's certainly dividing politics, but it's a very personal situation. So this has been 20 years in the making, the blue economy. So what Gunter did initially was put 3,000 scientists together, an organisation called ZERI, Zero Emissions Research. It used to be Institute, it's now Zero Emissions Research and Initiatives. And they started to look at what were the great solutions that were out there that were inspired by nature. What are the game changers? So they came out, Gunter came together, put a book out a couple of years ago, and it comes as a report to the Club of Rome, and it does talk about 100 innovations in the next 10 years that will generate 100 million new jobs. He talks about the work that they've done to date has very much been the think tank. Now he is saying it is up to us, the do tank, to go out to take these principles out into the marketplace. To date, they've generated about 4 billion in investments and around 3 million in jobs. Probably the most sophisticated of them is the biorefinery in Sardinia. The interesting component there is, what is a big waste product that they have in Sardinia? In the blue economy, you look at what is local, and one of the big issues for them, surprisingly, was the thistle. How much do you think you can earn out of a tonne of thistle waste? How about nearly $4,000 a tonne? They are getting about 8 different oils from the thistles. 8 different oils, and last year in the first year, 600 million for 1 year. So they're getting elastomers and esters out of it. They are substituting particularly things like rubber, where we have, I know that there are many companies today like Nike who are saying we won't use any more virgin products, so they won't even grow their own plantations. They want to use the rubber that currently exists. But to take something that is a waste that people are paying thousands of dollars to try and kill with toxic chemicals, it's slightly innovative, isn't it? The other thing that they didn't expect to come out of this, and I have the utmost respect for people now who study the most obscure things. There was a woman who did a PhD on thistles. She came to Gunther and said, "Did you realise that on the end of the flowers there is actually a fine enzyme that we need for the manufacture of cheese? They've been manufacturing it synthetically for years." So this now has become, and it's really spurred on, the cheese industry in Sardinia, all over something that, as I said, was a waste that they were pouring toxic chemical over to try and get rid of. The most common of the innovations within the blue economy thus far has been very much the growing of mushrooms on waste. You can grow mushrooms on almost anything that's got some sort of cellulose structure. So whether it's old newspapers, whether it's cuttings, especially if you're a farmer, you've got pear trees, you've got apple trees. They don't like clean sap, but there's almost not a cellulosic structure that mushrooms won't grow on. And our mushroom expert, Ivanka, I was fortunate to have spent some time with her in Belgrade last year when I actually went off to the summer school to study the blue economy. And she has been working with communities at all sorts of levels in terms of growing mushrooms on coffee waste. Let me just talk a little about coffee. Most people don't realise that in fact coffee, I think it's the second or third highest commodity in the world, we actually waste 99.8% of coffee. So if we take the coffee dregs, forget the plant, etc. before that, but let's just take the coffee dregs and see what we can do with it. So growing mushrooms has been something very successful, but they're also taking those dregs, they're leaching it, they're getting the lipids out of it. They're now making textiles out of coffee waste. An idea that a company in Taiwan came up with when they were in a coffee shop, it was a Starbucks coffee shop, thinking, well, what's in here that we could potentially use? And they started to experiment with coffee. One of the things that they've learned is coffee helps repel odour. It doesn't absorb odour. So they have sporting attire these days, clothing that is UV protected, it is fast drying, and it doesn't absorb odour, all made from coffee. We're also seeing that it's fantastic in things like shoes, to stop our shoes from being smelly. So companies like Timberland have been buying this product from this company in Taiwan who are making this particular material. Biofuels, they're now using coffee to make batteries. They're using it to repel odour in paint. It's extraordinary what they're doing. And it can also be composted, and it can be used in gardens to repel certain animal species. But if we just look at the system of what's going to happen to waste coffee if we grow mushrooms. So it comes in, we add some mycelium, we might add some other bits and pieces to it. it fruits, we then have the final product. We can sell it fresh, we can dry it, we can dehydrate it. But then if we look at it from a systems point of view, we've learned that if you take the substrate in which the mushrooms have grown, it makes a fantastic fodder for livestock, very high protein. So you can pelletize it or feed it to them as is. Once, of course, they've done that, others are using it in agriculture, others are actually taking that substrate and using it in packaging. These things don't need to be waste, and we just need to be a little bit innovative in terms of what we're going to do with that. So once it's in fact been eaten by perhaps our livestock, well then let's take the droppings of that and actually use that as a biofuel. Not just use it from the onset as a biofuel, but let's make sure that we get as much use out of that as we can. And in fact, what they have been doing is great marketing. So if you think about 1 cup of coffee can be turned into 2 t-shirts. How many coffee shops do we have in this city? How much waste could we be taking and be using to actually do something useful with it? Now, the mayor of Paris, she wants to put 1,000 old shipping containers around the city to grow mushrooms. That's not crazy, particularly when you think how many mushrooms that the French use. Urban agriculture is today big business, and you don't need a huge facility or size to be able to do it. I understand that they're making around 40 to 60,000 euro a year out of growing mushrooms in an old shipping container. That's not a big size for what can actually come as an output to it. We've talked a lot about urban agriculture today, and I just want to flag my new hero, Steve Ricks here. He has started something called the Green Bronx Machine, and when you get my notes, there's a link that you can go have a look at him speaking and see what he's doing. And he has taken the city of New York, the Bronx, one of the most disadvantaged communities, certainly in the US, and one of the most horrific around the world. The average family income in the Bronx has been $20,000 a year. We are talking about kids who are very, very disadvantaged. They are now earning themselves $17 an hour. A whole family that was living off $20,000 a year to these kids coming through because there's been a focus on certainly healthy living, growing their own food. They are now taking what they are learning at school and teaching that to businesses, not just in the Bronx and in the US, but right across the United States. And can you imagine, on the bottom right here, this image, what they're growing there is actually in Rockefeller Center. So this has become something that is really filtering through to so many levels across the United States. But up on the left-hand side here, this was an old, rundown, not being utilised for anything, turned into somewhere that they can actually be producing and growing food. It's transformed their worlds. And as Steve says, it's certainly easier to raise healthy kids than to fix broken men. And he's done an extraordinary job with what he's done with his school kids. And it's hard to imagine, isn't it, that this is the classroom in the Bronx. And look at the quality of the food that they're producing, what they're now eating. The kids' health has been transformed, and it's certainly transforming not just them, but their families and their communities. I could go forever just on that, but I'm going to move on. So there are 21 principles that guide the blue economy. One of them is that nature only works with what's locally available. The Green Bronx Machine did that extremely well. So what are the assets that you've got? I just mentioned before that we've got a lot of coffee shops where sadly that is probably just going into either landfill or compost, whereas they could be doing something significant with it. We now have something called stone paper. We are making paper with no trees and no water, and it is recyclable forever. Stone paper. They are making it from the waste of old building products and they're also taking it from old mining camps. So calcium carbonate, and what they're doing is they're literally setting up a factory. One of them has been established right next to an old mining camp where they're literally pulling out the waste calcium carbonate that otherwise would be creating a health problem with the dust in the atmosphere. So what do we have locally? One of the other principles is replace something with nothing. And we have many introduced species. I know foxes were brought in here primarily for hunting, which, anyway, that's something else I don't want to delve into, but we need to question any resource that isn't necessary. What are we using that's not necessary? This is a typical example from a production point of view. In the United States alone, they can fill the Empire State Building 2 times over just with the little section from inside your toilet roll. One company has decided to go away with that. It's part of Kimberly-Clark. It's their natural brand that they've gone down this path. So it is ultimately going to actually save them money in doing that. It is saving waste. This is not rocket science. If you don't need it, question whatever it is that you are using. You can probably get rid of it. This is one of my favourite innovations. This is a platform technology that has many, many applications. And it is that we've been inspired by the water vortex. If you think about vortices, we have vortices that are pumping the blood through our body. They create the hurricanes. Every time we flush the toilet, it's literally a spiral, isn't it? So there is a technology produced out of Sweden, the Retreatkoh company, and what they do is they allow us to replace something with nothing. And I'm going to give you a number of examples. This basically is what it looks like. They're not particularly heavy. They're actually 3D printed. They're very solid, no moving parts. So in fact, when they sell them, they will last for years and years and years and years and years. So the technology itself, so the water can come through the tap water. One of the real secrets is it's degassing. And it can be utilised for a number of different things. Let me share some with you. Irrigation, this is one of my favourites. They've done some incredible testing in recent times. It makes the water wetter. You need less water, you need less fertilisers, and in fact, it's actually increased the crop yield, the weight and the shelf life by the water going through these vortices. So they did some testing in Dubai, where they've done testing in all sorts of places, but it was able to improve the cucumber crops in Dubai dramatically. So the total yield in kilos was about 6.35% higher, but probably the real gem in it is that the rejects that they would normally have on cucumbers was less by 19.75%. So about a 25% higher yield. And this is, I'm just showing you a couple of examples that they've done some testing, but it's been done on all sorts of things, and it normally comes out at about the same, and it gives them longer shelf life. So they've done similar testing in another food centre in the Netherlands. Similar results. So you can see they're just basically a plug-in that we're talking about here. And the quality of the produce is definitely superior and apparently better tasting. So there was some testing done a couple of years ago with grapes here in Australia. And unfortunately, when they were actually doing the collection and the harvesting, they didn't separate out. The harvester just went and collected everything and they weren't measured. So we can't tell you exactly what the increase was, but they grew grapes in land where they'd never had fruit before, in clay soils. So the results have been quite extraordinary. Just a simple plug-and-play situation. They're also using this particular technology to grow food in the air, with the air. So in the desert and in space, this is a technology they're having very similar results with, getting higher yields, better quality, etc. All through a water vortex. They're also using it in cooling towers, and this is one of my favourites for cities because you think about the HVAC systems on so many of our buildings, and they're using chemicals to descale. You can plug this system in to the cooling towers and you no longer need to use chemicals. Less than a 2-year payback period. The US, particularly the US, but the US, Canadian and European governments at this point in time have all given in financial incentives to companies to utilise this, particularly in California where they've got such a major water problem, so that the water can be reused. But that, replacing something with nothing, this is a really great example of it. So less wear and tear, also high electrical conductivity, so it's a terrific innovation. So it can be used domestically, and it's certainly great for regions where they're using bore water. Years ago, I grew up in Townsville, and we lived slightly out of town, and we used to go through a hot water system every couple of years, primarily because there was so much scale and line build-up. You know, our mirrors in our bathrooms and things, it was always problematic. This sort of thing can actually eliminate that, but it's also certainly a very good alternative in some instances to reverse osmosis. Less wear and tear. It's being utilised to aerate in sewerage with lakes, with rivers. In fact, Europe at the moment, they are changing some policy, introducing some new policy that by 2020, all the river systems need to actually have clean, tested clean water coming out through them. So Retreatkoh have actually been working with a number of the governments over there in terms of this system being utilised to clean those river systems. Imagine if we had something like that here, particularly in terms of the Great Barrier Reef. But it should be all of our river systems. And as one country starts, it will flow on. But this is the sort of technology that we're talking about here. This is another one that's quite fascinating. Ice rinks. You would just think that, you know, however you produce your ice is going to pretty much be the same. But the ice is harder. It means that they can skate faster on it. It is reducing the energy costs in ice rinks by up to 80% of their energy costs. It's quite extraordinary what this technology has been able to do and transform. And again, there are incentives, less than a year payback with some of these. So we don't have a lot of ice skating rinks, but certainly in Northern Australia we're producing a lot of ice, so to be able to do it harder, faster, more efficient. So again, another one of the principles. In nature, one process generates multiple benefits. So some of you are probably familiar with the living filter systems. So this is a system that was developed by NASA to actually produce clean air for the astronauts. And this was something that was about 1996. So if we actually, they normally need quite a variety of plants, about 150 different varieties is usually about what they look at. So it really does mimic a rainforest. But there's a lot that we can learn by studying nature. So with biomimicry, and if we actually go and study the rainforests, that's how we've actually been able to produce these microalgae, etc., that can clean the air in our buildings. So as the air circulates, the pollutants are actually trapped on the surface of all of the leaves. It's constantly watered, and all of those pollutants get broken down into the soil. So it's a closed loop system here. And it minimises dust, allergens, airborne infections, so asthma sufferers, etc. So this particular airport, it's Sweden, I believe, they introduced this some years ago, and it's used to clean and oxygenate that recycled air and reduces the need for air conditioning. And we're talking about reducing energy costs by 70%. So again, financial imperatives to encourage people to be taking these things on. And let's not forget the added value of the improved health and well-being. So another principle, responding to basic needs with what you have and introducing innovations inspired by nature with multiple benefits, offering more with less. So termite mounds. I'm not sure how many buildings in Australia are using this system. There could be one. I'd like to know if you do have very specific information on it. This is a building in Harare in Zimbabwe, built by an architect, or designed by an architect called Mike Pearson. I know he developed and designed a building down the road, but I don't think they've taken all of this on board. Where they're inspired, instead of using all of the glass that traps and creates a lot of the heat, this is actually very similar to a building from the UK that's across from Buckingham Palace, and this particular shopping centre, using the passive design and the cooling of the termite mounds, it reduces their energy costs, so they have no air conditioning, reducing their energy costs by 90%. This is a hot climate that we're talking about, and this is very effective cooling systems and heating systems, basically taken by the inspiration of termites. We look at waste. One man's waste becomes, you know, the foundation for another product. There's a company called TerraCycle in the United States. They've recently moved to Australia, and I'm so excited that they're here because they do amazing work. Imagine taking all those really nasty things, you know, they take used chewing gum and cigarettes. They're building all sorts of things out of waste cigarettes. How many pubs and clubs and people who are smokers at home, those mounds of cigarettes, then that's all going into landfill. You can literally post it to them now, and they will take all of this, and they're recycling all of these materials. So we just need to be a little bit innovative in what it is that we're doing. And we don't have to go down, and I sometimes still think that from a green point of view that we're still a little bit too linear, and we're not thinking far enough. So if we just look at our food, we were talking about food earlier, one of the big innovations in the food area in the blue economy has been the introduction of the black soldier fly. Have you guys done much with the black soldier fly? So it's eating the food that's there. You're maggot farming, basically. Those maggots are tremendous. They've got great wound healing applications. But more importantly, as our world grows, and the middle class, particularly across Asia, all want to start to eat chicken and fish and more of that, what's going to feed them? We need something that's going to feed them. And there are now maggot farms, not terribly sexy, but I can tell you, big business, this is how we're going to create jobs. And this is what we need to feed ourselves into the future. But what we need to think about is, what's the business model? And I've heard one or two today talk about the business models. So whatever your product is, whatever your waste stream is, there is something that can be done with it. I heard someone talk before about sawdust. I think they talked about sawdust, and I thought to myself, well, sawdust, they make great sugars. There are great sugar extracts if you've got the right biorefinery to do something with whatever your product is. So we are really seeing some fantastic innovation now with the blue and circular economies. So just a quick summary of the differences between the blue and the green economy. So the green has very typically been linear. Not always, but very typically linear. And a lot of unintended consequences with that. Blue is certainly physics and systems led. Green has traditionally been much more elite and expensive and often subsidised. Blue is much more about innovation. What do we have to work with? Green, you know, creating waste. We're talking zero waste from a blue point of view. Subsidised, not subsidised. But we don't want to cut costs. We actually want to create jobs. The blue economy is very much adding jobs. And it has a real abundance mentality to it. And it's very much about sharing and creating communities, real win-win-win scenarios. The present employment crisis, especially amongst the young, does not permit us to pursue a business model that aims to cut costs by cutting employment. A model that offers the best for everyone's health and the environment is the most expensive. That's where we've been. The time has come to shift towards a competitive business model that allows producers to offer the best at the lowest prices by introducing innovations that generate multiple benefits, not just increased profits. So we can unleash creativity, entrepreneurship, improve our buildings and our infrastructure, our manufacturing, our food security, our well-being, by thinking in systems guided by the rules that govern nature. So that is the blue economy. It's a huge subject. You can easily go and buy the book. It's something that's very new in this country. We are, for those who might want to learn a little bit more, we have a one-day workshop in Melbourne on the 17th of April. There's some flyers outside. So thank you very much, and I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. Thank you.